That afternoon, I received an urgent call from my wife. Her voice was trembling. "Don't ask questions. Take the red bag from the bedroom closet and leave the house right now." The call ended before I could ask what was happening. I secretly returned through the back alley, grabbed the bag, and prepared to escape. But the sound of tires made me freeze. Looking through the bedroom curtain, I was stunned. 3 police cruisers and 4 black SUVs were surrounding my home, and the person holding the arrest warrant for me was the very man I had trusted for 11 years. I'm so grateful you're here with me today on Revenge Dad. Before I continue, tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I read every single one. A quick note, this story contains some fictional elements included for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is entirely coincidental, but the lesson inside it is something I believe we all need to hear. The irrigation valve wasn't cooperating, and my lower back was reminding me loudly that I was 66 years old and had no business crouching in a garden bed for 40 minutes. I straightened up, pressing one hand against my spine, and looked out across the yard. Helen had spent 30 years building into something worth looking at. Rosemary along the south fence, Meyer lemon in the corner, a flagstone path. She'd laid herself 1 stone at a time the summer Logan turned 12. Silver Lake was quiet on December afternoons, the kind of quiet that made you believe nothing bad could reach you here. My phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. I pulled it out expecting a reminder about the dentist, or maybe Logan asking if we were free for dinner. Instead, the screen showed Helen's name, and the moment I saw it, something cold moved through my chest. Helen didn't call during the day. She texted, short practical messages, picked up your prescription, dinner at 6. She'd been that way for 40 years, and I'd learned to read the difference. A call meant something was wrong. "Helen!" I pressed the phone hard against my ear. Her voice came through broken barely above a whisper, like she was cupping her hand around the phone so no one nearby could hear. "Jack, don't ask questions. Go home. Get the red bag from the bedroom closet, the one behind the winter blankets, and leave the house. Right now." My mouth went dry. "Helen, where are—" "Don't ask questions." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear her fighting to hold herself together. "Please, Jack, just do it. Please." The line went dead. I stood in the garden for exactly 3 seconds staring at the screen. Then 38 years of muscle memory took over, and my body started moving before my mind had finished processing what she'd said. I didn't take the main road home. 38 years with the LAPD teaches you things that never fully leave, and one of those things is that you never walk through the front door when you don't know who's waiting on the other side. I looped around through the neighborhood's back streets parked 2 blocks east on Reddsdale and came up through the alley behind our property. The house looked normal from the outside, porch light off, blinds the way Helen always left them. But the front door was unlocked, which Helen never did in the middle of the afternoon, and when I eased through the back gate and let myself into the kitchen, I felt it immediately. That particular quality of stillness that meant something had already happened. I'd felt it 100 times walking into crime scenes. I'd never expected to feel it in my own kitchen. I moved through the house quickly, the way I used to move through buildings. I wasn't sure about back to the wall, wait forward every doorway cleared before I passed through it. The bedroom was at the end of the hall. Helen's side of the closet smelled like the cedar sachets she replaced every spring. I pushed past her coats, past the stacked boxes we kept, telling ourselves we'd sort through past 2 heavy winter blankets. And there it was, a red leather bag, medium-sized, slightly worn at the corners, the kind of bag that could sit in a closet 4 years without drawing attention. I didn't remember it, couldn't place it, couldn't say when it had come into the house or how long it had been sitting behind those blankets. I grabbed it and turned to go. That's when I heard the tires. Not one car, multiple cars. The specific sound of heavy vehicles braking hard and fast, the kind of coordinated stop that law enforcement trained for. I crossed to the bedroom window and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. 3 LAPD cruisers, 4 black SUVs. They'd fanned out across the front of the property with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before, and officers were already moving into position along the perimeter of the yard. Then one of the SUV doors opened and a man in a dark jacket stepped out holding a document in his right hand. My stomach dropped to the floor. Daniel Price. I knew that face the way I knew my own reflection. We'd worked side by side for 11 years, shared case files and bad coffee and too many late nights to count. Daniel Price, who'd been the one to call me 5 years ago, with the news that the evidence storage facility had caught fire, who'd stood in my office with his hands in his pockets and told me that everything we'd built against the Blackwood case was gone, who'd looked me in the eye while he said it. A warrant has been issued for the arrest of Jack Morrison. The loudspeaker crackled Daniel's amplified voice, filling the quiet December street, on charges of money laundering and financial fraud. All occupants of the premises come to the front door with your hands visible. Emmys. My hands were shaking. Not from fear I'd been afraid before, genuinely afraid, and I knew what that felt like. This was something else. This was the particular physical sensation of a world rearranging itself into a shape you didn't recognize, every assumption you'd been standing on, suddenly gone. I pressed my back against the bedroom wall, the red bag clutched against my chest, and forced myself to breathe. Think. You've been in worse. You've been in rooms where people were pointing guns at you, and you thought your way out. Think. The back fence. The alley. My car 2 blocks east on Redesdale. I moved. Through the kitchen, out the back door, across Helen's garden, my heel catching the edge of her flagstone path, the one she'd laid herself 30 years ago. And I almost went down, but caught the lemon tree and kept going. Over the fence in a way that would have embarrassed me on any other day, landing hard in the alley knees, screaming in protest. I was running. 66 years old, lower back, still aching from the irrigation valve, running down a Silver Lake alley with a red bag I couldn't explain, clutched against my ribs. Behind me, I heard them breach the front door. The canyon road had no streetlights, and I drove it the way I used to drive surveillance routes, headlights off windows, down moving by memory and instinct through the dark. Topanga Canyon at night smelled like sage and cold chaparral, and the smell hit something deep in my chest, some part of me that remembered being younger and less afraid of what the dark might be hiding. Ray Kowalski had bought this cabin in 1987 and handed me a spare key the following Christmas. If you ever need to disappear for a while, Jack, you know where to go. Ray had been dead 6 years now, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ending he would have hated, and I'd never used the key. Until tonight. The cabin was small and cold, and smelled like wood that hadn't been warmed in a long time. I found a kerosene lamp on the kitchen shelf, got it lit after 3 tries because my hands were still shaking badly enough to make the matches difficult, and set it on the table. Then I sat down and stared at the red bag. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pressed both palms flat against the table and made myself breathe, in for 4, out for 4. Then I reached for the bag. Inside, 3 cassette tapes, an old hard drive, 2 thick manila folders, and at the very bottom, a notebook with a blue cover. Helen's handwriting on the front in black marker. For Jack. Read this first. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. Her handwriting was neat and careful. Helen had been an elementary school teacher for 22 years, and she wrote every letter like it mattered. The first page made my eyes burn before I'd finished the second sentence. If you're reading this, they found the bag. I'm sorry I never told you. I was afraid. She'd started writing 3 weeks after I retired 5 years ago. License plates of dark SUVs parked across our driveway, 4 of them, dates and times recorded in careful columns. Late-night phone calls that disconnected the moment she answered. Logan asking questions at Sunday dinner that made her stomach hurt. Did Dad bring any files home from the Blackwood case? While her hands shook under the table where I couldn't see them. I had to stop reading twice because my eyes were too wet to see clearly. Then I reached the entry from 11 days ago and my blood turned to ice. I moved the blankets in the closet and I saw the bag and I took it out to check that everything was still inside. I don't know why I did it. I've left it alone for 5 years. I put it back after a few minutes. I don't think anyone saw, but I've had a sick feeling ever since. One time in 5 years, a few minutes. And somehow, through a camera we didn't know existed, they had seen her do it. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, jaw-locked, eyes shut. Then I reached for the TV remote on Ray's dusty shelf, telling myself it would probably be fine. My own face looked back at me from every channel. Authorities are seeking former LAPD detective Jack Morrison in connection with an ongoing federal money laundering investigation. I sat in Ray Kowalski's cabin, with Helen's notebook pressed against my ribs, staring at a version of myself I didn't recognize, and felt something crack open in my chest that felt terrifyingly close to despair. The news anchor kept talking. I sat there on Ray's old couch with the springs gone soft and listened to a version of my life being described by someone who had never met me, and every sentence landed like a fist in the stomach. Authorities recovered what they describe as substantial physical evidence from the Silver Lake residence, including undeclared cash, fraudulent identification documents, and a handwritten ledger containing records of financial transactions spanning 18 months. A handwritten ledger. I'd never kept a handwritten ledger in my life. 38 years of police work, and I'd typed every report, logged every expense, filed every document through official channels, because that was the only way anything held up in court. My hands balled into fists against my thighs. Sources within the department indicate that the accounts in question were opened using Morrison's verified personal information, including his social security number and home address. I grabbed the remote and turned the volume up, which was possibly the opposite of what a rational person would do. But I needed to hear every word. I needed to know exactly what they were saying so I could figure out exactly how it had been built. The camera cut to a close-up of what they were calling the ledger. A reporter was holding it up open to a specific page, and a producer somewhere had made the decision to zoom in on the handwriting to make it legible on screen. I leaned forward so fast my knee hit the coffee table and sent a cloud of dust into the lamplight. There. On the third line from the top, clear as anything. Blackwood Logistics. Not logistics, logistics. Missing the second S. The letters transposed in a way that created a word that didn't exist in any dictionary, but had existed until recently in a string of emails between my son and his wife. 3 months ago, it must have been October, because the jacarandas on our street were still dropping purple blossoms on the sidewalk. Logan had forwarded me an email chain by accident. He'd meant to send it to Vanessa, and instead, it had landed in my inbox, and I'd read the first few lines before I realized it wasn't for me. What I'd read hadn't made much sense, references to consulting fees and quarterly projections, but one thing had caught my eye. The name Blackwood Logistics spelled wrong in the subject line. Yeah, and I'd called Logan about it that same evening. Son, I'd said, you've got a typo in your subject line. Logistics has 2 S's. Logan had laughed the easy laugh he used when he was slightly embarrassed. Dad, you're the only person on earth who would call to tell me that. Spell it right, Logan. It looks unprofessional. He'd said he would fix it. He hadn't. I was on my feet now, pacing the length of Ray's small cabin, my mind running faster than it had in years. The despair from 20 minutes ago burned completely away by something that felt electric and sharp and almost like anger, but wasn't quite. I went back to the manila folders. The first one contained financial records, transaction histories, account, statements, transfer, confirmations. The kind of paperwork that told a very clear story if you knew how to read it, and I knew how to read it. I spread the pages across Ray's kitchen table and started working through them the way I used to work through evidence at the precinct, one document at a time, building the picture from the ground up. The accounts bearing my name had received wire transfers from 3 different investment funds. Those funds had received their money from a single source, a consulting firm called Morrison Strategic Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware 6 months ago. I didn't own a consulting firm. I had never registered a business in Delaware or anywhere else. But the registered agent's address on the incorporation documents was a mailbox service in Century City, the same neighborhood where Logan's office was located. I sat down heavily in Ray's kitchen chair, and the chair groaned under me, and I pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the paperwork until the numbers stopped swimming. The accounts had been opened on a specific date. I knew that date. I knew exactly where I had been on that date because you don't forget the day a surgeon cuts into your knee while you're unconscious and reassembles things that had been grinding wrong for 2 years. I had been at Cedars-Sinai. I had been under general anesthesia from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. I had been in the recovery room groggy and nauseous and incapable of signing my own name until 6 in the evening. Logan had driven me to the hospital that morning. Logan had handled the intake paperwork because I'd been too nervous to focus. I'd never had surgery before, not in 66 years, and the anesthesia had frightened me more than I'd admitted to anyone. Logan had taken my wallet, my insurance cards, my ID. He'd said he needed them for the admissions desk. He'd had everything he needed for approximately 11 hours. My chest felt like something had reached inside it and twisted hard and deliberate, and I had to breathe through it the way I'd breathe through the worst crime scenes, the ones that stayed with you for decades. In for 4, out for 4. Logan had done this. My son, the boy I'd coached through Little League, the one who'd called me crying from his college dorm at 2 in the morning because he'd failed his first economics exam and thought his life was over. The one whose face I'd seen in Helen's when he was born and thought this is the best thing I have ever done. That Logan had taken his father's identity like it was something that belonged to him. Like I was just a resource to be used. The phone. I needed a phone that couldn't be traced back to this cabin or to any number they already had on file. I dug through Ray's kitchen drawers until I found what I was looking for, a gas station receipt from 3 years ago, which meant Ray had driven past a gas station 3 years ago, which meant there was probably a gas station on the Canyon Road I could reach without getting on the freeway. I grabbed the red bag, checked that everything was back inside it, and headed for the door. The kerosene lamp was still burning on the table. I almost went back to turn it off, then left it. Ray had always said a light in the window was the loneliest thing in the world. Tonight, I thought he might have been right. I was halfway to my car when the burner phone I'd bought at the gas station 20 minutes later, cash no receipt buzzed with a number I almost didn't recognize. Almost. But 38 years meant you didn't really forget anything. Sarah Coleman's voice came through before I'd finished raising the phone to my ear, low and direct with the particular controlled urgency of someone who had very bad news and very little time. Jack, I know you didn't do this, but you need to talk to me right now because they are moving fast and we are already behind. I pulled off the canyon road onto a gravel turnout and killed the engine. Through the windshield, the lights of the San Fernando Valley spread out below me, like something spilled thousands of points of light that didn't know or care what was happening to one 66-year-old man parked on a dark hillside with a red bag and a burner phone. Talk to me, I said. At first, are you somewhere safe? Sarah's voice had that quality I'd always associated with her in a courtroom. Every word placed deliberately, nothing wasted. She'd put 4 members of the Blackwood family's business network away for wire fraud 9 years ago, and she'd done it with the same tone she was using right now. Calm, precise, absolutely furious underneath. Safe enough, Topanga, a place nobody knows about. Good. Don't tell me the address. I mean that Jack don't say it out loud on any phone, not even this one. I heard her exhale. I've been watching the federal filing for the past 2 hours. The evidence package against you is extensive. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. My jaw tightened until I could feel it in my temples. How extensive? Social security number, home address, 2 forms of digital signature that match your known signing patterns, and 3 financial institutions all reporting the same account holder. Jack, if I didn't know you personally, if I were a federal judge looking at this cold, I would sign the warrant too. She let that land. That's how good it is. It's not good, I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended, rough with something I couldn't quite contain. It's manufactured. Sarah, the ledger they found in my house, Logan wrote it. I can prove it. There's a typo in the company name Blackwood Logistics spelled wrong, missing the second S. Logan made the same mistake in an email 3 months ago, and I called him to correct it. He didn't fix it. 3 seconds of silence. Then, that's our thread. Talk me through the rest. So I did. Sitting on that gravel turnout with the valley lights below me and the sage smell coming through the cracked window. I walked Sarah through everything, the red bag, Helen's notebook, the cassette tapes I hadn't listened to, yet the financial records in the manila folders, the consulting firm in Century City, the Delaware registration. The accounts opened on the day I was under general anesthesia at Cedars-Sinai, while my son was holding my wallet and my insurance cards and every piece of identifying information I owned. When I finished, Sarah didn't speak for a long moment, and I could hear her thinking, not silence, but the particular quality of someone processing information very quickly and very carefully before they committed to a direction. "Oh, the surgery date," she finally said. "That's the crack in their foundation. If we can prove those accounts were opened while you were under anesthesia, the entire chain of custody for the evidence collapses." She was already moving. I could hear it, the sound of her pulling up something on a computer, keys clicking in the background. "I need your surgeon's name." "Patricia Webb. She's at Cedars. I haven't seen her since the follow-up appointment, but she'll remember the case. I was a difficult patient. Kept trying to leave early." Sarah made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That tracks. I'll locate her and get a sworn statement about the timing of your procedure." More typing. "Now, tell me about the consulting firm. Morrison Strategic Consulting. You said Delaware registration. 6 months ago. The registered agent's address is a mailbox service in Century City, same neighborhood as Logan's office. I'm running it now. A pause. There it is. Filed in Delaware, registered agent is a firm called Pacific Administrative Services. They handle incorporations for about 400 companies in that building. Another pause longer this time. Jack, the firm has a bank account linked to it, and the signatory on that account. Logan, I said. It wasn't a question. Logan Michael Morrison. Her voice had gone very flat. The account received transfers from 2 shell funds before the money moved into the accounts bearing your name. The paper trail is designed to look like you were the endpoint, the beneficiary, the man at the top of the structure. I pressed my free hand against my sternum because my chest was doing something complicated and painful that I didn't have the vocabulary for. My son had not just framed me, he had built a financial architecture that made me look like the architect of the entire scheme, the man who'd orchestrated the fraud he'd spent 38 years fighting against. There's something else, I said. The company name. Blackwood Logistics spelled wrong. Logan made that mistake because he'd been using it in his own correspondence for months. If we can pull his emails of Haftsieras, Yaskek Denimand. We can't pull his emails without a warrant, and right now, the judicial temperature is not in our favor. We need something they can't dispute physical evidence or a witness. She stopped typing. Speaking of witnesses, Jack, I have to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm when I do. My hand tightened on the phone. Tell me. Arthur Mills is alive. The name hit me like cold water. Arthur Mills, Senior Compliance Officer at Pacific Rim Commercial Bank. The man whose testimony had been the cornerstone of the original Blackwood investigation 5 years ago. Arthur Mills, who had been reported dead in a single-car accident on Interstate 8, 2 weeks before the evidence storage fire, whose funeral I had not attended because I hadn't believed it, and whose absence I had spent 2 years trying not to think about. Where? My voice came out barely above a rasp. It's San Diego, Chula Vista specifically. He's been living under an assumed name, not fraudulent documents, just a different name, which is legal for 5 years. She let me absorb that. I found him through a contact at the federal marshal's office. Jackie's been waiting. He knew someone would come looking eventually, he said. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had shifted slightly, something underneath it that sounded almost like grief. He said he stayed close enough to be found because he owed you that much. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against them, hard furious at myself for the reaction, and then decided to stop being furious about it, because Helen wasn't here to see it, and I was alone on a dark hillside, and I had earned the right to let my eyes burn if they wanted to. I need to talk to him, I said. I know, I'm texting you his address right now to the burner, so write it down and delete the message. More keys. Jack, one more thing before you go. Say it. Her voice dropped half a register. And what came through was not the prosecutor's precision, but something older and more personal. They sent the text to your phone, the real one, the one that's probably been logged as evidence by now about 40 minutes ago. Unknown number. It said, "Stop looking. We have Helen." The gravel turnout, the valley lights, the sage smell, the burner phone, all of it receded to a great distance, and what replaced it was a roaring in my ears like water, and the feeling of my own heartbeat slamming against the inside of my chest so hard it hurt. Jack, Sarah's voice pulled me back. Jack, I need you to breathe. I'm breathing, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. We are going to find her, but I need you functional. Do you understand me? I need the detective, not the husband. Can you give me the detective right now? I stared through the windshield at the lights of the valley below, all those thousands of ordinary lives continuing in the dark, and felt something in me go very still and very cold and very focused in a way I hadn't felt in 5 years. You've got him, I said. Send me Arthur's address. I drove back to the cabin with every window down and the cold canyon air hitting my face hard enough to keep me from thinking too much about Helen. Thinking about Helen right now would undo me completely, and I couldn't afford to come undone. Not yet. Ray's cassette player sat on the shelf above the fireplace, a battered Sony from the early 90s that he'd refused to replace, because, as he'd once told me, anything built before 1995 was built to last, and everything after was built to be replaced. I'd argued with him about that. I wished I could argue with him about it now. I fed the first tape in and pressed play. Raymond Blackwood's voice filled the small cabin like something toxic being released into a sealed room, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once believed consequences applied to him. He was discussing wire transfer schedules with someone I didn't recognize, referencing account numbers and routing codes with the casual familiarity of a man reading a grocery list. 3 senior officers at Pacific Rim Commercial Bank were named. Dollar figures were attached to each name. The smallest figure made my stomach turn. I stopped the tape after 12 minutes. My hands were shaking again, but differently from before, not from fear or grief, but from the particular rage of a man who had spent 38 years watching people like Raymond Blackwood operate just outside his reach, and was now holding proof that they had never been outside his reach at all. They had simply bought the people who were supposed to close the distance. The second tape was worse. Daniel Price's voice. My chest physically contracted when I heard it, a sharp, involuntary tightening, like a fist closing around my ribs. Daniel, who had sat across from me at the precinct lunch table 3 times a week for 11 years. Daniel, who had given a speech at my retirement dinner about integrity and service and what it meant to spend a career doing the right thing. Daniel describing in precise operational detail how he had arranged for a junior officer to leave a specific door unlocked on a specific evening, and how the accelerant had been introduced, and how the fire inspector had been persuaded to file a report that supported the accidental ignition theory. I hit stop and stood up from the table so fast the chair fell backward and cracked against the floor. I walked to the cabin door, shoved it open, and stood in the cold pre-dawn air with my hands braced against the door frame and my eyes pressed shut and my jaw locked so hard I thought something might break. Helen was somewhere in this city right now, tied to a chair or locked in a room because of the man whose voice was on that tape. Because of my son. Because 5 years ago, someone in that evidence storage facility had made sure I would walk away with nothing. I gave myself 60 seconds, counted them out. Then I went back inside, picked up the chair, sat down, and pressed play on the third tape. The meeting on the third tape had taken place approximately 3 months after my retirement, based on a date reference someone made early in the recording. The voices were Daniel and 2 men I didn't recognize until one of them said something that made every hair on my arm stand up. Morrison's son has significant debt. Personal loans, a failed business venture 2 years ago that his parents don't know about. He's been servicing it quietly, but he's running out of runway. Daniel responded, "How long before he needs to make a decision?" 6 months, maybe 8. Vanessa can manage the timeline. She's good at this. I stopped the tape. I sat there in Ray Kowalski's kitchen with the pre-dawn dark pressing against the windows, and felt something shift fundamentally in the way I understood the past 3 years of my son's life. Logan hadn't stumbled into this, hadn't been corrupted by proximity to the Blackwood money, or seduced by Vanessa's world after the fact. He had been selected, researched, targeted like a mark, his weaknesses cataloged, and his timeline managed, and Vanessa had been deployed into his life with a specific purpose. Every dinner we'd had with them, every Christmas, every phone call where Logan had seemed distracted or evasive, and Helen had squeezed my hand under the table because she could always read the room better than I could. All of it had been architecture. My eyes were burning again, and this time I didn't fight it. I let them burn. I pressed the heels of both hands against them and sat there in the dark and let myself feel the full weight of what had been done to my son before he ever made the choices that had brought us here. Then I picked up the burner phone and called Logan's number. It rang 4 times. 5. I was preparing for voicemail when the line connected, and the breathing on the other end told me everything before a single word was spoken. Shallow. Fast. The breathing of someone who had been waiting for this call and was terrified it had come. "Dad!" Logan's voice cracked down the middle like green wood. You shouldn't be calling me on." "I know about Vanessa," I said. "I know how it started. I know they came to you." I paused. "I'm not calling to fight with you, son. I'm calling because I need you to understand something." My voice broke on the last word, despite everything I did to stop it. "Whatever happens next, I know they chose you on purpose, and I need you to know that I know that." The line went completely quiet except for Logan's breathing, which had changed slower now and uneven in a way that meant he was fighting tears. He didn't think he had the right to cry. Then the call disconnected. I stared at the phone in my hand, set it down on the table next to the 3 cassette tapes that had just rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 5 years. Then I picked up Ray's car keys, grabbed the red bag, and headed for Interstate 5 South. Arthur Mills had been waiting long enough. The house on Mariposa Avenue in Chula Vista looked exactly like every other house on the block, cream-colored stucco, a single palm tree in the front yard, blinds drawn against the midday sun. Nothing about it said, "A man has been hiding here for 5 years." That was probably the point. I sat in the car for 2 minutes before I got out. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be sure of what I was walking into. Arthur Mills had been a careful man 5 years ago, careful enough to stay alive when at least one person connected to the Blackwood case hadn't. Careful men in hiding didn't always react well to being found, and I'd come too far to have this go wrong in the first 30 seconds. I walked up the front path and knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then the sound of movement inside, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of someone who had decided to answer rather than someone who hadn't heard. The door opened on a security chain first, and one eye looked at me through the gap with an expression I recognized immediately because I'd worn it myself in the worst years of my career. The expression of a man who has been afraid for so long that fear has become indistinguishable from breathing. "Mr. Mills," I said. "My name is Jack Morrison. I was the lead investigator on— I know who you are." His voice was rougher than I remembered, scraped down by years and cigarettes and probably a great deal of insomnia. "I've been wondering when you'd show up." The chain came off, the door opened. Arthur Mills had been 66 when I'd last seen him my age now, which struck me as strange in a way I couldn't articulate. And 5 years of living under a different name in a cream-colored house in Chula Vista had added a decade to his face. His hair had gone from salt and pepper to entirely white. His hands, when he stepped back to let me in, had the particular tremor of someone whose nervous system had been running on high alert for years without relief. But his eyes were sharp, painfully sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent 5 years watching every car that slowed in front of his house and remembering every face he'd ever seen twice. "You look terrible," he said, which, under the circumstances, I thought was fair. "Helen's been taken," I said. "I need your help." Something moved across Arthur's face, pain or guilt, or the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for a bill to come due and had finally heard the knock at the door. He turned away from me and walked into the kitchen without speaking, and I followed him because I didn't have the luxury of waiting for a formal invitation. He filled 2 mugs from a coffee maker on the counter, set one in front of me without asking how I took it, and sat down across the table. His hands were shaking badly enough that the coffee rippled in the mug when he set it down, and he pressed both palms flat against the table, the same gesture I'd been making for the past 18 hours, like he was trying to hold himself together through direct physical contact with something solid. "I should have come forward years ago," he said. "I know that. I've known it every day for 5 years, and I still couldn't make myself do it." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and he cleared his throat hard, the sound of a man who refused to cry in front of someone he barely knew. "I have a daughter in Phoenix and 2 grandchildren I've never met in person, because I was afraid to stay connected to anyone who could be used to find me. My daughter thinks I had a breakdown after the accident that killed the other Arthur Mills." He paused. "He was a retired school teacher from El Cajon. Wrong place, wrong time. They needed a body, and he provided one." My stomach turned. "You knew about that?" "I found out 2 weeks after it happened. That's when I understood exactly what I was dealing with." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "What do you need from me, Mr. Morrison?" I pulled the financial records from the red bag and spread them across his kitchen table. Arthur leaned forward, and I watched the transformation happen. In real time, the frightened man, receding the banker, emerging 40 years of pattern recognition, kicking in, despite everything his nervous system was doing. His eyes moved across the pages with the focused precision of someone reading music. "These accounts bearing your name," he said after 3 minutes, "were not opened through standard retail banking channels." He pointed to a reference number in the upper corner of one statement. "You see this prefix? This is an internal administrative code. These accounts were created through the bank's back-end management system." He looked up at me. "Only a small number of people had access to that system, senior directors and the compliance oversight team. Can you trace who accessed it?" "The system logs every login, IP address, timestamp, user credentials." He set the page down. "I no longer have access to those logs, but if a federal forensic team pulled the server records, we're working on that. What I need from you right now is a sworn statement confirming that these accounts couldn't have been opened through normal channels and that the access would have been logged." I met his eyes. and I need you to be willing to testify to that." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, the most ordinary sound in the world, the sound of a neighborhood that didn't know it was sitting 30 feet from a man who had been hiding from a murder conspiracy for half a decade. "If I testify," he said carefully, "I need guarantees, not promises, guarantees. My daughter in Phoenix, my son-in-law, the grandchildren." His voice tightened on the last word, tightened the way voices do when people are talking about the specific thing they cannot afford to lose. "I need them somewhere safe before I sign anything." "I have a contact at the U.S. Marshal's office," I said. "Sarah Coleman, former federal prosecutor, she knows the system. I'm calling her the moment I leave this house, and I will not leave this house until you've heard her voice confirm protection for your family." Arthur looked at me for a long time. Not suspicious exactly, more like a man taking the full measure of something before he committed his weight to it. "You know what the worst part has been," he said. "It hasn't been the isolation. It hasn't been losing my career, my name, my grandchildren's first years." He pressed his lips together until they went white. "The worst part has been knowing that the evidence existed, that there was enough to put Raymond Blackwood and a dozen other people in federal prison, and instead, I was living in Chula Vista under a dead man's first name while they kept operating." His eyes had gone bright with the particular shine of someone fighting tears and winning barely. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Morrison. I'm glad someone came." I called Sarah from Arthur's kitchen table, and the three of us talked for 40 minutes, and by the end, Arthur's hands had stopped shaking. Not completely, but enough. I was pulling out of Mariposa Avenue northbound back toward Los Angeles when I checked the rearview mirror out of habit and felt the specific cold recognition of someone who has been followed before. A dark SUV, 4 cars back. Not the same vehicle as the one Helen had noted in her journal, but the same posture, maintaining exactly the distance a professional maintains when they don't want to be obvious and have slightly miscalculated. I tightened my hands on the wheel and kept my speed exactly at the limit. They'd been tracking the financial record searches. Of course they had. Arthur Mills hadn't survived 5 years by being easy to find, which meant whoever was in that SUV hadn't found him through Arthur. They'd found him through me, which meant they already knew what I just learned, and they were going to make sure I didn't get the chance to use it. 23 years of driving the streets of Los Angeles teaches you things that no map can replicate. You learn which blocks dead end without warning. You learn which alleys connect to which side streets and which ones don't connect to anything at all. You learn the difference between a car that happens to be going the same direction and a car that is following you, and you learn it the way you learn everything important, by being wrong about it once early in your career, in a way that cost you something you couldn't get back. The SUV stayed 4 cars back all the way up I-5. Professional distance. Patient. I gave them 40 minutes of thinking they were invisible before I took the exit for Boyle Heights and started working through the neighborhood grid in a pattern that looked random and wasn't. 3 left turns and 4 blocks. A cut through a parking structure on Cesar Chavez with 2 exits on different streets. A stretch of Figueroa where I ran a yellow light that turned red before they could follow without being obvious about it. By the time I crossed the LA River and headed up towards Silver Lake, the rearview mirror showed me nothing but ordinary traffic and the particular orange-gray of a Los Angeles December afternoon bleeding into dusk. I pulled over on a side street and sat for 3 minutes watching. Nothing. I pressed both hands against the steering wheel and exhaled for what felt like the first time since Chula Vista. Then I reached into the red bag on the passenger seat and pulled out Helen's notebook, flipping to the pages where she'd documented the cars. She'd noted the route she'd been driving when they forced her over Sunset Boulevard westbound between Hyperion and Virgil. I knew that stretch. I'd driven it 1,000 times. And if Helen had been forced off the road there was a body shop on the north side of Sunset that had been there since the 80s. Marcus Tate's place, the kind of establishment that survived 4 decades in LA by being useful to the neighborhood and invisible to everyone else. I found parking half a block east and walked the rest of the way. The shop was still open barely. The roll-up door halfway down, a pair of legs visible underneath a lifted Silverado country music, playing from somewhere inside at a volume that suggested Marcus Tate had opinions about acoustics. I ducked under the door. "We're closing up," said the legs. Marcus Tate. The creeper rolled out, and Marcus Tate sat up, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. He was somewhere around 50 built, like someone who had spent those 50 years doing physical work with a face that had been weathered by sun and skepticism into something that didn't give much away. He looked at me the way men who have lived in Los Angeles their whole lives look at strangers who show up at closing time, not hostile exactly, but not open either. Depends on who's asking, he said. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photograph of Helen. It was from last Thanksgiving, the two of us at the kitchen table, Helen laughing at something Logan had said. Her eyes were bright and her head was tilted back, and she looked exactly like the woman I had been married to for 41 years. The woman who had spent 5 years being afraid so I wouldn't have to be. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. "That's the lady from 2 days ago," he said. "The one on Sunset." He stood up slowly the way men with bad knees stand up and toss the rag onto his workbench. I wondered if someone was going to come asking about that. What happened out there wasn't right, man. It wasn't right at all. My throat tightened so hard it hurt to swallow. "Can I see your camera footage?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He crossed to a battered metal cabinet against the wall, pulled out a tablet that looked completely out of place in the grimy shop, and spent 45 seconds navigating to a security application. "Insurance company made me install the system 3 years ago," he said by way of explanation. 4 cameras, one faces the street. He turned the tablet toward me. The timestamp read 2 days ago, mid-afternoon. The quality was better than I'd expected, high-definition, wide-angle, capturing the full breadth of sunset in both directions. I watched Helen's Accord come into frame, moving westbound at a normal speed. Then, a dark SUV appeared from a side street, accelerating to close the distance. A second vehicle materialized ahead of her, cutting across lanes to block the road. The whole thing took 93 seconds. 4 men, coordinated, practiced the movements of people who had done this before. Helen stepped out of the Accord. She didn't run, didn't fight, and for a moment I couldn't understand why, and then I did. She'd stepped out because running would have made it worse, and Helen Morrison had spent 41 years being the smartest person in any room she walked into, and she'd understood in those seconds what would and wouldn't help. But before they moved her to the SUV, she turned. She turned toward Marcus Tate's camera and looked directly into the lens for 4 full seconds. Her face was completely calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid. I knew her well enough to see the fear underneath in the set of her jaw and the way she was holding her shoulders, but the calm of someone who had decided that fear was not going to be the last thing she showed. She was leaving me evidence, even then, even in that moment. She was still trying to take care of me. My eyes flooded so fast I had to turn away from the tablet, pressing the back of my wrist against them, hard. My chest heaving once with something that wasn't quite a sob, but was close enough to embarrass me. Marcus Tate, to his considerable credit, found something extremely interesting to look at on the other side of the shop and gave me 20 seconds before he spoke again. "That vehicle," he said, his voice careful, "the one that came from the side street. I ran the plate on my own because it bothered me. Came back to a company called Sentinel Shield LLC. He paused. "I don't know what that is." I did. I pulled up the name on my phone and confirmed what I already suspected. Sentinel Shield LLC, private security contractor, registered in California 14 months ago. The listed principal officer was a name I was starting to see everywhere I looked. Vanessa Morrison née Blackwood. Not contracted, not hired, not a third party brought in to handle something at arm's length. Vanessa had built this company herself, staffed it herself, and used it directly. There was no distance between her and what had happened to Helen on that street. None. "I need a copy of this footage," I said, turning back to Marcus. My voice was steadier than I had any right to expect. "Everything from that 2-hour window. I need you to send it directly to a contact of mine, a former federal prosecutor named Sarah Coleman. I can give you her secure email right now." Marcus studied me for a moment. "This going to bring trouble to my shop? It's going to bring trouble to the people who did that to my wife," I said. "Your shop stays out of it. You have my word." He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded. Once the nod of a man who has decided something, not the nod of a man who is still thinking about it. "Give me the email." I called Sarah on my way back to the car and gave her everything: Sentinel Shield, Vanessa's name, on the registration, the footage timestamp, Marcus's contact information. Sarah absorbed it with the efficiency of someone who'd been building a case in her head for the past 24 hours, and had just been handed the piece that made the structure load-bearing. "This connects Vanessa directly," she said. "Not through Logan, not through the Blackwood organization. Her, personally." That's what I thought. "Jack," her voice dropped. "I submitted the footage request for a federal warrant this afternoon. There's a complication. The judge initially assigned to the application has ruled in favor of Blackwood-connected interests 3 separate times in the past 2 years. I've filed for reassignment, but we lost approximately 12 hours in the process. 12 hours! Helen had been wherever they were, keeping her for 2 days already, and we had just lost 12 more hours. I sat in my car on the side street off Sunset, with my hands pressed flat on my thighs, and told myself very deliberately that 12 hours was not the end of anything. That I had found Arthur Mills, and I had this footage, and I had Sarah, and I had 38 years of knowing how to keep moving when everything was trying to make me stop. I told myself that. I almost believed it. Before I tell you where Helen was being held, and what Jack discovered when he got there, drop a "still here" in the comments, so I know you're with me, because what comes next changed everything. Heads up, the next part of this story contains some fictional elements built for storytelling purposes. It may not reflect every detail of reality, and if that's not your kind of content, it's okay to step away now. But if you're staying, you won't want to miss what happens next. Daniel Price left his apartment in Koreatown at 9:47 in the evening, which told me 2 things: he was going somewhere, he didn't want to be seen going during daylight hours, and he was comfortable enough with the situation to think he wasn't being followed. He was wrong on the second count. I'd been parked outside his building on Harvard Boulevard for 4 hours, which is the kind of thing that sounds impressive until you've actually done it. 4 hours in a car in December, with the heater running intermittently, because a running engine draws attention, eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like the plastic it had been wrapped in, watching a door. 4 hours is nothing. I'd done longer than that, more times than I could count in the 38 years. Though my back had registered a formal complaint somewhere around the 3rd hour that I was choosing to ignore. Daniel drove a gray Tahoe newer model, the kind of vehicle that said government contractor, without quite saying it out loud. I let him get half a block ahead before I pulled out, keeping my headlights off for the first 2 blocks, the way I'd learned to do in a city where nobody looked at anything that wasn't directly in front of them. He took surface streets south through downtown, then picked up the 110 towards San Pedro. I followed at a distance that felt too far, and then felt right, and then felt too close again, the way tailing always felt when you were doing it alone without a partner to run the radio. 38 years, and I'd never fully gotten comfortable with solo surveillance. Ray Kowalski used to say that was healthy, that the day you got comfortable doing it alone was the day you started making mistakes. I thought about Ray a lot that night. The 110 fed into Harbor Boulevard, and Daniel turned east on a road that ran parallel to the waterfront, the kind of industrial access road that existed for truck traffic and people who didn't want witnesses. The smell of the harbor came through the vents even with the windows up, salt and diesel, and the particular damp cold of water that had been sitting against concrete for decades. Somewhere out in the dark container, ships were moving, their lights visible on the black water like a second city floating on the bay. Daniel turned into a lot behind a warehouse on Water Street and killed his lights. I pulled over 150 meters back and cut my engine. The warehouse was the kind of building that had probably been useful in the 1970s and had been declining gracefully ever since. 3 stories of corrugated metal and concrete, the windows either boarded or broken, a loading dock along the south face that hadn't seen a truck in years. But the lot behind it held 6 vehicles. 2 I recognized as the same model of SUV that had appeared in Marcus Tate's camera footage, and the exterior had 3 security cameras positioned at angles that covered the main approach, the loading dock, and the east side of the building. I counted the cameras twice. 3 cameras, positioned by someone who knew what they were doing, which meant they'd thought about coverage, and they'd thought about blind spots, and people who thought carefully about. One usually thought carefully about the other. I spent 20 minutes working the perimeter from a distance, staying in the shadows of the adjacent lots, moving in the patient, unhurried way that doesn't draw the eye the way hurrying does. The west face of the building had no camera. It also had an old drainage pipe running from the roof to a concrete channel at ground level, wide enough, I estimated, for a man who was willing to make some unpleasant decisions about the structural integrity of corrugated metal. It also had something else. The electrical panel for the building was mounted on the west wall at chest height inside a metal housing with a latch that had rusted open. Someone had installed it there in an era before security cameras and threat assessment protocols, back when putting the electrical panel in the most accessible location was simply efficient. In the dark facing a wall with no camera coverage, it was something else entirely. I made a note of it and kept moving. Helen's Accord was parked behind the building, tucked between a chain-link fence and a rusted shipping container. I stood in the shadow of the container for 60 seconds and looked at the car and thought about Helen driving that car to the grocery store on Saturday mornings. The way she always brought home one thing that wasn't on the list, because something had caught her eye, the way she'd set it on the counter and say, "I thought we could try this." 41 years of Saturday mornings. I called Sarah. "I found where they're keeping her," I said. "Water Street Warehouse, San Pedro. I'm looking at her car right now." Sarah exhaled sharply. "Jack, don't go in alone. Captain Ortega's tactical team can be mobilized. Give me 90 minutes. 90 minutes is too long. I know it feels that way." "Sarah," I kept my voice low and level, "I'm not going in yet. I'm going to do reconnaissance first. But I need you to start moving Ortega now, so that when I call you back, his team is already positioned, not 90 minutes away already there." A pause, then, "I'll make the call, but, Jack, you listen to me. Right now, you go in there without backup and something goes wrong. There's no one to pull you out. Or Helen. I understand that. Do you, as I start moving Ortega," I said and ended the call. I found a gap in the chain link along the north side of the lot and worked my way to the drainage pipe on the west wall. Up close, the pipe was older than I'd hoped and more solid than I'd feared, the kind of cast iron construction they had stopped using 50 years ago, because it was expensive and lasted forever. I tested my weight against it carefully, the way I tested everything these days, with the awareness that 66-year-old bodies have opinions about cast iron pipes that 26-year-old bodies don't. It held. I went up slowly, hand over hand, my back making its opinion known, in language that would have been inappropriate in most professional settings, and reached the gap between the pipe housing and the building wall, with my arms shaking from the effort in a way that I found deeply humiliating and completely irrelevant to the situation at hand. The interior of the warehouse was dark except for light bleeding under a door at the far end of the ground floor. I moved along the inside wall, testing each step before committing my weight, navigating by the ambient glow from the dock windows and the thin line of light from that distant door. I was 15 feet from the door when I heard Vanessa's voice, clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman conducting a business meeting rather than holding someone's wife against her will. "We don't need him to hand over the bag," Vanessa said. "We only need him to show up. When he does, and he will, because that's who Jack Morrison is. He always shows up, the story writes itself. Retired detective under federal investigation, found at the scene of a kidnapping, armed, resisting." She paused to let that settle. "The police response will handle the rest." Another voice, male, someone I didn't recognize, said, "And if he doesn't come, he'll come," Vanessa said, with the flat certainty of someone who had studied their target long enough to understand him completely. "But if he needs motivation, make the call. Tell him midnight or we send her back in pieces." My hands balled into fists so tight my knuckles ached. I pressed my back against the wall and breathed, in for 4, out for 4. Then I pulled out my phone and checked the pin. 3% battery. I typed Sarah's number, from memory opened a text, typed the address and the word "here" and the word "Ortega" and hit send while the screen was still lit. The phone died before I could see the delivery confirmation. I stood in the dark warehouse with a dead phone, and Vanessa's voice still hanging in the air, and the smell of salt water coming through the broken dock windows. And I made myself think clearly about what I had and what I didn't have, and what came next. I had a location, a layout, a blind spot on the west wall, and a man with a tactical team who was hopefully already moving, because Sarah Coleman had never in her professional life waited for someone to tell her twice. What I didn't have a working phone confirmation that the text had sent, or any idea what was happening on the other side of that door. I needed to find out. The electrical outlet was behind a shelving unit on the west wall, which meant moving the shelving unit, which meant making noise, which meant doing it slowly enough that the sound stayed under the threshold of the voices coming from the room at the far end of the floor. It took 11 minutes. I know because I counted the way I used to count in situations where counting was the only thing keeping the rest of my mind from running somewhere I couldn't afford for it to go. 11 minutes of moving a metal shelf unit 3 inches at a time across a concrete floor in the dark, stopping after each movement to listen, breathing through my mouth so the sound of my own breathing didn't interfere with my hearing. When the outlet was clear, I plugged the phone in and crouched against the wall and waited. 2 minutes for the Apple logo to appear. Another 90 seconds before the phone was functional. I had 4% battery and no way to charge beyond what those 3.5 minutes had given me. So I opened the voice recorder, pressed record, and slid the phone into my breast pocket with the microphone facing out. Then I moved toward the light. The door to the interior room was steel industrial, the kind that belonged on a loading dock rather than an interior wall. Someone had retrofitted it into the building's frame at some point, which meant this room had been modified for a purpose after the fact. It stood open by about 4 inches, which was enough. I positioned myself against the wall beside the door frame and looked through the gap. The room was maybe 30 feet across. Work lights on portable stands cast everything in the flat white glare that makes people look like they're already in a photograph. Helen sat in a metal chair near the center of the room, her wrists bound to the armrests with zip ties, her ankles crossed and free. They hadn't bothered with her ankles, which meant they weren't worried about her running, which meant there were enough people between her and the exit that it hadn't seemed necessary. Her posture made my chest ache in a physical way I hadn't expected. She sat completely straight, not rigid, not performative, but with the particular quiet dignity of a woman who had decided that the way she held herself in this room was the one thing they couldn't take from her. 22 years teaching 8-year-olds had given Helen Morrison a spine that had nothing to do with the bones in her back. Vanessa stood near the far wall, her phone in her hand, attending to something on the screen with the focus of someone who ran meetings this way, present in body elsewhere, in attention, confident enough in her control of the room not to feel the need to demonstrate it. Logan stood near the door on the opposite side of the room from me. He had his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, and he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere expecting one thing and found something else entirely and had not yet decided what to do with the distance between them. He hadn't known. I was certain of it now, watching him the set of his shoulders, the way his weight shifted every 30 seconds like he was looking for somewhere to put it. Logan had known about the plan to frame me. He had not known about Helen. Vanessa had made that decision without him. Helen turned her head and looked at Logan. "You were 4 years old," she said, "the first time you got lost in a grocery store. Do you remember that?" Logan's head came up slowly like the question had reached him from a long way away. "I remember," he said. His voice was rough in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, since the years when he'd been learning to be a man and hadn't quite figured out yet how much of it was going to hurt. "You were in the cereal aisle and I turned around and you were gone." Helen's voice was completely steady, not cold steady, which is a different thing entirely. "I screamed your name so loud that 3 employees came running. I found you 4 aisles over, trying to read the ingredients on a box of crackers because you just learned how to read and you wanted to try it on everything." The corner of her mouth moved almost a smile, but not quite. "You weren't lost at all. You knew exactly where you were. I was the one who was lost." Logan pressed his lips together until they went white. "Mom, your father worked the overnight shift for 2 years when you were in middle school." Helen continued, her voice still that terrible steady thing that was harder to hear than shouting would have been. "He never told you because he didn't want you to feel like a burden. He didn't want you carrying weight that he thought was his to carry. He came home at 6 in the morning and slept for 4 hours and was at your Little League games by noon. And you never knew the difference because he didn't want you to. He never—" Logan's voice broke. He stopped, tried again. "He never thought I was good enough, Mom. Every time I made a decision he didn't agree with, every time He was frightened for you," Helen said. "There is a difference between a father who thinks his son isn't good enough and a father who is so terrified of something happening to his son that he holds on too tight. You are 51 years old, Logan. 38. You are my son," Helen said, "and I am sitting in this chair with my hands tied, and I need you to hear me right now." Her voice didn't waver, not once. "You did not end up here because your father failed you. You ended up here because someone identified a wound and put their hand in it and held it open until you couldn't think clearly anymore. That is what was done to you." She looked at him with the directness that had made her the most effective teacher in every school she'd ever worked in. "But you are still standing in this room, and that is still a choice." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had been handed something true and didn't know yet what to do with it. Logan turned his face away. His jaw was working. His eyes were bright and wet and furious at himself. I thought more than at anyone else in the room. and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth like he was trying to physically hold something in. Vanessa looked up from her phone. "This is touching," she said, with the tone of someone noting a minor inconvenience. "But we have a timeline." "Logan." Helen's voice sharpened, and Logan looked back at her despite himself. "I need you to know something before whatever happens next. Your father and I have had 41 years. 41 years of Saturday mornings and arguments about the thermostat and him leaving his coffee cups on the wrong shelf and me reorganizing his bookshelves when he wasn't looking." A tear ran down her left cheek. She didn't move to wipe it because her hands were tied, and she didn't look away from her son. "Those 41 years are not nothing. They are not something anyone in this room can take from us. And whatever you decide to do in the next hour, I need you to know that I know who you were before all of this. I need you to know that your father knows it too." Logan made a sound that wasn't a word. He turned away from his mother and walked to the far corner of the room and stood there with his face to the wall, his shoulders shaking in a way he was clearly furious at himself for and completely unable to stop. In my breast pocket, the voice recorder was still running. I reached up carefully and touched the outside of my jacket, feeling the slight outline of the phone through the fabric, and made myself think about the practical question of how to get the audio file to Sarah with 4% battery and no working call function. The warehouse had a Wi-Fi network. I'd connected to it automatically when I'd plugged the phone in unsecured, which was either negligence or a trap, and I was choosing to believe negligence because the alternative wasn't useful right now. I opened the voice memo, selected the file, opened Sarah's contact, attached and sent. The battery icon turned red and showed 1%. Then my phone buzzed once, a single vibration that meant the message had been delivered, and the screen went dark for the last time. I pressed my back against the wall, the dead phone in my hand, and listened to Logan cry in the corner of a warehouse in San Pedro, while Vanessa Blackwood scrolled through something on her phone, and Helen Morrison sat in a metal chair with her back straight and her face wet and her eyes open, watching her son and waiting for him to decide who he was going to be. Then my own phone, the one I'd thought was dead, buzzed one more time. An incoming text. 1 bar of battery somehow still alive. "Sarah, audio received. Ortega is 2 blocks out. You have 15 minutes. Do not go in before he arrives." I looked at the text for a long time. Then I looked at the door. I looked at Sarah's text for 4 seconds. Then I put the dead phone in my pocket and started moving back toward the drainage pipe. Not because I was following orders. 38 years of police work had burned most of my instinct for following orders into something more complicated and situation-dependent than the word obedience could really cover. I moved because Sarah was right. I had one chance to get Helen out of that room, and one chance meant I needed every advantage I could manufacture in the next 15 minutes. And the best advantage I had was that the people in that room didn't know I was already inside their building. The moment I walked through that door, I lost that advantage forever. I went back the way I'd come, west-walled drainage pipe, the cold harbor air hitting me like a wall when I cleared the top and started down the outside. My arms were shaking worse than they had been going up the specific exhausted tremor of muscles that had been asked to do too much for too long, and I made it to the ground and stood there for 10 seconds with my hands on my knees, breathing hard, telling my body that it could register its complaints in the morning. My car was parked on a side street 2 blocks north. I covered the distance at a pace that was technically jogging and was in practice the fastest thing my knees were willing to authorize tonight. The glove compartment held what I needed, or most of it. An emergency kit that Helen had insisted on assembling 3 years ago, and that I had rolled my eyes at, and then never once regretted having a flashlight, a multi-tool, a foil emergency blanket, a spare phone charging cable, and at the very bottom, beneath the first aid kit, a small portable battery pack that Helen had added after the second time I'd called her from a dead phone, asking her to look something up. The woman had been taking care of me for 41 years without ever making me feel like I needed to be taken care of. I pressed the charging cable into the portable battery and into my phone simultaneously, and by the time I reached the all-night convenience store on Harbor Boulevard, I had enough battery to make one call. Sarah picked up before the first ring finished. "Tell me you're out of the building." "I'm out," I said. "Listen, I need you to do something for me before I go back in. The real bag. It's in the cabin in Topanga inside the closet behind the emergency kit on the left shelf. I need you to send someone to retrieve it tonight and secure it as potential federal evidence." "Already done," Sarah said, and I heard the particular satisfaction in her voice of someone who had anticipated the request. I sent a marshal up there 2 hours ago after you sent me the location. The bag is in federal custody as of 40 minutes ago. Something unknotted in my chest. Good. Jack Ortega's team is in position. 2 vehicles on Water Street, 2 more on the access road to the east. They have eyes on all 4 building exits. She paused. You have 12 minutes before the window closes, and we go in regardless. What's your plan? I was already inside the convenience store, moving through the aisles, with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed and had very little time to get it. Red bag there, a canvas tote in the right shade of red, on a display near the register. The kind of bag that sold for $4 and would fall apart in a week, but would hold together for the next 40 minutes, which was all I needed. I grabbed it and added a gas station road atlas for weight and bulk. 2 blocks down, a 24-hour auto parts store was still lit. I went in and picked up a small magnetic GPS tracker from the automotive shelf, the kind marketed to fleet managers and worried parents, no ID required. The total came to $27. I paid cash and was back in the parking lot in under 4 minutes. My plan, I said into the phone, loading the atlas into the red tote, folding the top to approximate the shape of a full bag, is to walk through the front door and give them what they're waiting for. Jack, with a tracker inside and the real bag in federal custody, I continued. The moment they open it and find out it's not what they expected, there's going to be a window of about 10 seconds where everyone in that room is focused on the bag and not on me or Helen. I tested the weight of the tote in my hand. That's enough. 10 seconds is not enough. 10 seconds has been enough before. You were 40 years old the last time you said something like that. Her voice was sharp, but underneath the sharp, I could hear something that I recognized as fear, and Sarah Coleman was not a woman who let fear into her voice easily. Promise me you wait until Ortega's team is ready to breach. Where are they breaching? East entrance and loading dock simultaneously. The moment you signal, they go. What's the signal? The lights go out, she said. Ortega's team sees the lights go out, they breach in 30 seconds. I stopped walking. The electrical panel on the west wall, the latch that had rusted open, the absence of any camera covering that section of the building. Sarah, I said slowly, I was already planning to cut the power. A pause. Then with the tone of someone who had just realized they'd been playing chess with a man who'd already seen the next 6 moves. Of course you were. Tell Ortega 30 seconds from lights out, I said. I'll take the west entrance after I cut the panel. You come in from the east and the dock. Helen is in the interior room center of the ground floor, steel door currently open 4 inches. 30 seconds from lights out, Sarah repeated. Jack, please don't get shot. Working on it, I said. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my inside jacket pocket. The tote bag went under my left arm. I turned toward Water Street and started walking. The cold had deepened in the hour since I'd first arrived, the harbor wind cutting through my jacket in a way it hadn't earlier, and I walked into it with my head down and my hands loose at my sides, and my mind doing the thing it used to do before the worst operations going, very quiet, very specific, breaking everything that was about to happen into individual components that could be addressed one at a time rather than as a single overwhelming event. Step 1, west wall, electrical panel cut power. Step 2, front door. Step 3, put the bag down and sees what happened next. 38 years of police work. 38 years of walking into rooms where bad things were happening and figuring it out from the inside. This was not different in any way that mattered, except that the woman in the chair in the center of the room had spent 41 years being the most important thing in my life, and I had about 8 minutes to make sure she stayed that way. I turned onto Water Street. The warehouse sat at the end of the block, 3 stories of corrugated metal and broken windows lit from within by the flat white work lights that leaked around the edges of the boarded dock windows. I could see the silhouettes of 2 of Vanessa's people near the front entrance, which told me they were expecting me to arrive, the way visitors arrive through the front, visible on their terms. I went around the west side instead. The electrical panel latch lifted on the first try, the rust that had corroded it open working in my favor for once. I found the main breaker by, feel in the dark, a double pole breaker at the top of the panel, the kind that fed the whole building, and wrapped my hand around it. I thought about Helen sitting in that metal chair with her back straight and her hands tied and her face wet and her eyes open. I thought about Logan in the corner with his shoulders shaking. I thought about Ray Kowalski, who had bought this case file, a cabin in the hills, and a spare key and 6 years of somewhere to go when everything fell apart. Then I pulled the breaker, tucked the tote bag under my arm, and walked through the front door of the warehouse into absolute darkness. Absolute darkness is not nothing. 38 years of police work teaches you that darkness is a material, something with weight and texture that works for you or against you, depending entirely on which side of it you're standing on. I'd cut that breaker from outside in the dark with my eyes already adjusted. The people in that room had been under work lights for hours. They were blind. I was not. I moved through the main floor of the warehouse the way I'd mapped it in my head during the 20 minutes I'd spent inside earlier, 15 feet from the entrance to the first stack of shelving units, hard left, to avoid the support column, then straight south toward the door. I moved fast and low and quiet, the tote bag tucked against my chest, counting steps. From inside the room, the sound of the lights cutting out had produced exactly the reaction I'd anticipated. A half-second of stunned silence, followed by voices starting to talk over each other. The particular cacophony of people who had a plan and had just had it disrupted. What happened to the "nobody move" or "find the backup"? I counted to 3 and pushed the door open. The room was not entirely dark. A thin line of harbor light came through a gap in the boarded dock window on the south wall, enough to give shape to shadows without giving them detail. I could see the bulk of the shelving units, the outline of the chair where Helen sat, the movement of figures near the far wall trying to orient themselves. I set the tote bag on the floor directly inside the door and stepped left, immediately pressing myself against the wall. "I'm here," I said. "I have the bag." 3 seconds of silence. Then a flashlight beam cut across the room. Someone had come prepared and found the tote bag on the floor near the door. The beam swept left, searching for me, and I was already moving along the wall in the opposite direction. Daniel Price's voice. "Morrison, step into the light." "I'm stepping," I said, from a position 6 feet from where I'd been when I spoke last. The flashlight swung toward my voice. I moved again. It took Daniel approximately 4 seconds to understand what was happening, which was 3 seconds longer than it should have taken a man with his experience, but fear and darkness do things to tactical thinking that training can't entirely overcome. When the realization hit him, it came out as a kind of controlled fury. "Grab the bag," he said. One of Vanessa's people crossed the room. I tracked the sound of his footsteps. He reached the tote bag, and I heard the zipper, and then I heard the specific sound of a man pulling a road atlas out of a bag in the dark and not understanding immediately what he was holding. It's not there," the man said. Vanessa's voice came from the far right of the room, low and very cold. "Kill him." I was already moving. The muzzle flash came from Daniel's position, bright white, instantaneous. The shot going wide, left because Daniel was firing it where my voice had been, and not where I was. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous, a physical thing that rang in my ears and set my teeth on edge. I'd picked up the metal rod during my earlier reconnaissance, a piece of electrical conduit roughly 18 inches leaning against the base of the shelving unit near the west wall. I'd noted it the way I noted everything useful automatically because 38 years had made inventory a reflex. I came in fast from Daniel's left side, below the angle of the flashlight, and hit his gun hand at the wrist with the rod in a motion that was less about force than about geometry. The right angle, the right moment. Leverage doing the work that my 66-year-old arms couldn't do on their own. The gun clattered across the concrete floor and disappeared into the dark. Daniel made a sound of pain and grabbed for me with his free hand. I stepped inside his reach, which is counterintuitive but correct, and used his own momentum to put him against the shelving unit hard enough to knock the wind out of him. He went down. I was already turning toward Helen. "Jack." Her voice strained with the effort of speaking through whatever fear and relief were doing to her simultaneously came from the center of the room. I moved toward it, hands out navigating by sound. My hands found the armrest of the chair, found her wrists. "I've got you," I said, my voice dropping to something that wasn't quite steady and that I stopped trying to make steady. "I've got you, Helen. The zip ties." She was breathing hard, her voice cracking at the edges. "Jack, your hands are shaking." "I know," I said. "Hold still." The multi-tool from the emergency kit was in my jacket pocket. I found the blade by touch, opened it, and cut the zip ties on her right wrist, then her left. The moment her hands were free, she grabbed my arm with both of hers, not pulling me anywhere, just holding on her fingers, pressing in hard enough to leave marks. And I heard her make a sound that was not quite a sob, and not quite a word, but contained both things simultaneously. "I know," I said again. "I know. Come on." I pulled her up from the chair and moved her toward the north wall, away from where Daniel had gone, down away from the sounds of movement near the far side of the room. I could hear Vanessa somewhere to my right, moving fast, heading toward the door, and then I heard Logan's footsteps, quick and uneven, going in the opposite direction toward the east. Then the east wall exploded inward. That is not an exaggeration. Captain Ortega's team came through the east entrance and the loading dock simultaneously, and the combination of battering rams on steel doors and 12 people moving fast in body armor with tactical lights blazing produced an effect that in the darkness registered in the body as physical impact before it registered in the mind as information. FBI, nobody move, hands where we can see them. The tactical lights swept the room in crossing patterns, fast and methodical, and in the overlapping beams, I saw the whole room at once for the first time. Daniel Price on the floor by the shelving unit, one arm bent at an angle that suggested the wrist wasn't right. Vanessa near the south door, one hand raised and the other moving toward the pocket of her jacket before two agents were on her, and then her hands were behind her back and she was against the wall. Logan, caught near the east entrance, already stopped with his hands up his face when the light hit it, the face of a man who had run toward an exit and found himself relieved somewhere underneath the fear to find that it was blocked. Two agents swept toward Helen and me. I held up one hand, shielding her eyes from the tactical lights, keeping my other arm around her shoulders. "Jack Morrison," I said. "She's the victim. She needs medical." Helen's face was pressed against my shoulder. Her hands were wrapped around my arm, and her whole body was shaking with the force of something she'd been holding back since the moment they'd put her in that chair. And now that she didn't have to hold it back anymore, it was coming out of her, in waves, not crying exactly. More like the physical release of everything a person's body does when it has been afraid for a very long time and is suddenly all at once allowed to stop. I held on. The tactical lights kept moving. I heard Daniel being cuffed, heard Vanessa demanding her attorney in a voice that had lost its coldness and found something that sounded for the first time like a woman who understood that things were not going to go the way she had planned. I heard Logan say in a voice so small, I almost missed it under everything else, "Is she okay?" Captain Ortega appeared in front of me, late 40s, built like a man who took the physical requirements of his job seriously with the kind of direct eye contact that comes from spending a career in rooms where indirect eye contact got people killed. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "good work tonight." "Thank you for being on time," I said. 31 seconds from lights out, he said, and something in his expression suggested he found that worth noting. "Your wife needs to be seen by the paramedics outside." "I know," I said. Helen lifted her head from my shoulder. Her face was wet and her eyes were red, and she looked at me with an expression that I had seen in 41 years of marriage exactly once before the night Logan was born, when she'd looked at me from the hospital bed, with that particular combination of exhaustion and relief and something that didn't have a name because it was too specific to their moment to need one. "You took long enough," she said. Despite everything, the aching arms, the ringing ears, the dead phone in my pocket, and the 38-year career that had somehow come down to a metal rod and a road atlas in the dark, I laughed. Sarah's voice came through Ortega's radio, tinny and distant, but completely recognizable. "Tell me she's out." Ortega looked at me. "She's out," I said. "Before I show you what the FBI found on Vanessa's phone that night, something that broke Logan completely, comment justice below. Because what's coming next, nobody in that room saw it coming." One more note. The story ahead contains fictional elements woven in for educational and entertainment purposes. Names, places, and some details have been shaped for storytelling. If you prefer content presented differently, no judgment at all. But if you're still here, this next part is the one that matters most. The FBI's Wilshire field office at 2 in the morning had the specific quality of a place that never fully slept. Fluorescent lights at full brightness, regardless of the hour. The smell of burned coffee and recycled air. People moving through hallways with the focused purposefulness of those who measured time in case progress rather than clock position. I sat in an observation room on the 3rd floor with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched and watched through one-way glass as Sarah worked. She'd gone directly from San Pedro to Wilshire without stopping still in the clothes she'd been wearing when Ortega's team called her, and she moved through the building with the ease of someone who had spent enough years in federal facilities to stop finding them intimidating. I'd watched her conduct 3 separate interviews in 4 years of working cases together, and she was without question the most effective interrogator I had ever seen. Not because she was aggressive, but because she was patient in a way that made the people across the table from her feel the weight of every second she chose not to speak. Vanessa sat in interview room 1 with her attorney, a woman in an expensive suit who had arrived within 40 minutes of Vanessa's arrest, which told me the number had been on speed dial long before tonight. Vanessa herself said nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not a flicker of anything across her face that could be read and used. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at a point slightly above Sarah's head and waited. Daniel had lasted approximately 8 minutes before he started talking. I watched him through the glass hunched over the table with his injured wrist wrapped, and his career visibly ending in real time, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, and was probably some specific combination of both that only exists when the person who betrayed you turns out to have been afraid the whole time. Logan sat alone in interview room 3. His attorney had arrived within the hour, a young man in a rumpled suit who looked like he'd been pulled out of bed, which he probably had. Logan had listened to him for approximately 4 minutes, then asked him to wait outside. The attorney had objected. Logan had been politely immovable. He sat with his hands flat on the table and stared at the surface in front of him with the focused intensity of someone reading something only he could see. The door behind me opened and a man came in, carrying a laptop, late 30s, slight build, with the particular focused energy of someone whose brain operated faster than most people's, and who had long since stopped being bothered by that. "Eddie Reyes," he said, setting the laptop on the table beside me without preamble. "Cyber Division, you're Morrison." "I am," I said. "We got into her phone 40 minutes ago." He opened the laptop and turned it toward me. "Digital search warrant came through at 1:47. I want to show you something before I brief Agent Coleman." The screen showed a banking application, not an American bank. The interface was in English, but the institution name was Helvetica Private Geneva. The account holder field showed a single name, Vanessa Blackwood Morrison. Not Vanessa and Logan Morrison, not a joint account, one name. The balance field showed $4.7 million. Below the account summary, Eddie had pulled up a travel booking a single business class ticket Geneva, departing the following afternoon. One passenger. My hand tightened around the coffee cup until the cardboard crumpled. "One ticket," I said. "One ticket," Eddie confirmed. His voice was neutral in the way that forensic people learn to be neutral, not indifferent, just careful about what they attached emotion to, because attaching it to the wrong things made you less accurate. "The account was opened 14 months ago. Wire transfers began 8 months ago, consistent with the timeline of the financial scheme targeting you." I looked through the glass at Logan in interview room 3. He was still staring at the table, still alone. He had burned down everything he had, his family, his integrity, the version of himself that Helen had described sitting in that chair for a woman who had bought a plane ticket for one. Sarah appeared at the interview room door and looked at me through the observation window. I held up 4 fingers, then 7, then pointed at Eddie's screen. She read it instantly. 40 years of combined law enforcement between us. We'd developed a shorthand that didn't require words. She took the printed summary Eddie handed her and walked into interview room 3. I watched Logan's face when Sarah set the paper in front of him. He looked at it the way you look at something you suspected might be true and held yourself very carefully against knowing for certain, because certainty closes doors that uncertainty leaves open. 3 seconds where his expression didn't change at all. Then it changed all at once, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, but the way it happens in real life, which is quietly and completely like a structure that has been compromised for a long time, finally in one moment choosing to come down. Logan pressed both hands over his face and made a sound that came up from somewhere so deep it seemed to cost him something physical to produce it, a low, broken sound that had no word attached to it, because there wasn't a word in English for the specific grief of a man who had destroyed his own life for someone who had never, not once, intended to take him with her. His shoulders shook violently. His breath came in ragged pulls. He pressed his hands harder against his face, like he could hold himself together through direct physical pressure, and couldn't, and kept trying anyway. Sarah sat across from him and waited. After 90 seconds, Logan lowered his hands. His face was wrecked, swollen around the eyes, jaw trembling, the specific devastated look of someone who has run out of the thing they were using to hold themselves together. He looked at Sarah with the eyes of a man who had nothing left to protect. "I want to make a full statement," he said. His voice was barely functional, scraped down to almost nothing. Everything. From the beginning. I want to tell you everything. Sarah opened her notepad. Through the glass, I watched my son begin to dismantle the last wall he had left one brick at a time, and felt the specific pain of a parent watching a child face the full consequence of who they had chosen to become, not with anger anymore, and not with satisfaction, but with something much heavier and much more permanent than either of those things. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. Logan's attorney was a man named Gresham, mid-50s, careful eyes, the kind of lawyer who had spent his career understanding that the best thing he could do for certain clients was get out of the way at the right moment. He stood when I walked in, shook my hand with the precise professionalism of someone who understood exactly what kind of room this was, and then sat in the chair nearest the door and opened a legal pad, and became to the extent that a human being can become furniture. Logan didn't look up when I came in. I sat down across from him. The table between us was standard federal issue gray laminate bolted to the floor, the kind of surface that had absorbed a great many difficult conversations and showed none of them. The room smelled like the same burned coffee as the hallway outside. Through the small window near the ceiling, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn in Los Angeles, when the city hasn't quite decided to start yet. I looked at my son. He was 38 years old and he looked 60. The expensive haircut he'd had 3 weeks ago, I'd noticed it at the dinner we'd had at that Italian place in Los Feliz. The last normal evening any of us had spent together had been slept on wrong and was doing things hair shouldn't do. His shirt was wrinkled from the hours in the warehouse. His eyes, when he finally raised them to meet mine, were the eyes of someone who had been crying for a long time and had run out of tears and was now operating in the dry, raw state that comes after. He looked, I realized, like he had looked at 17, the night he'd called me from his college dorm after failing his first economics exam, stripped down to something essential and afraid and not sure yet whether what was underneath was enough. "Dad," he said. His voice was barely there. "I'm here," I said. He looked back down at the table. His jaw worked, his hands flat on the table in front of him, pressed downward like he was trying to push through the surface. Like resistance was the only thing keeping him from coming apart entirely. "Vanessa came to me 3 years ago." He started and then stopped, swallowed, started again. "She said she knew about the failed business, the loans I hadn't told you and Mom about." He pressed his lips together. "I don't know how she knew. I understand now that they'd been watching me for a long time before she made contact. But at the time, I thought it was coincidence. I thought she was just..." He stopped. "I thought she loved me." He said the last 4 words the way people say things that were true once and are still true in some form that can no longer help them. "I know," I said. I kept telling myself I was going to get out. His voice was steadier now, which was worse somehow than the broken version, the steadiness of someone recounting something terrible with the distance of a person who has accepted it. That once I had enough, I could pay back what I owed and walk away, and no one would ever know. That I could fix it before it hurt anyone. "There's never enough," I said. "That's the first thing this job teaches you." "I know that now." He finally looked up at me again and held it this time. "I took your wallet out of your jacket pocket when you were on the gurney going into surgery. You were already under the pre-anesthetic. You weren't even there, not really. And His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, hard held it there for 3 seconds, then lowered it. "I told myself it was temporary, that I'd put everything back before you noticed." I held his gaze and said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. Not because I was withholding something. There simply wasn't anything that wouldn't have been either too much or too little. "The money in the house," Logan continued. "The passport, the ledger." He exhaled through his nose a long, controlled breath. "I put them there the night before the warrant. I had a key you never changed the locks after I moved out." He looked at his hands. "Mom was at her book club. I let myself in and I put those things in your house, Dad, in the home you built." His voice cracked again harder this time. "I put them there to send you to prison." The words landed in the room and stayed there. "Did you know about your mother?" I asked. The question was quiet, not an accusation. A genuine question because the answer mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings that were going to follow this conversation. Logan shook his head immediately. "No, I swear to God, I didn't. Vanessa told me there would be pressure applied to Mom to stay out of it. I thought that meant I thought they'd threaten her, frighten her. I didn't know they were going to. He stopped. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright and wet again. When Vanessa told me they had her the night at the warehouse, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't. He pressed both hands flat on the table hard, the knuckles going white. I wanted to stop it. I didn't know how to stop it without making it worse. I kept thinking if I just waited, if I just let it play out, that she would be okay, and then I could. Don't and win no. You told yourself what you needed to tell yourself, I said, so you could keep going. Logan flinched like the words had physical weight. That's exactly what I did. I know. I leaned back in the chair. My lower back registered the movement with the weary protest of something that had been asked to hold tension for too many hours in a row. Logan, the night you called me from your dorm, you were 17. You'd failed an economics exam and you thought it was the end of the world. Logan frowned slightly, the frown of someone being led somewhere they can't yet see. You called me at 2 in the morning, I said. I was working a double shift. I stepped out of an active crime scene to answer your call. You never knew that. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel like a burden. I wanted you to call me. I always wanted you to call me. I looked at my son across the gray laminate table. That was a mistake, not stepping out of the crime scene, not answering, the part where I didn't tell you, the part where I thought protecting you from the weight of things meant keeping you outside the weight of things. I stopped. I spent 38 years keeping things from you because I loved you, and I think some of what happened to you happened in the space I left by doing that. Logan's face did something complicated and painful that I didn't have a name for. That doesn't make what you did acceptable, I said. I need you to understand that I know the difference between explaining something and excusing it. I know, Logan said. His voice was barely a sound. I need you to tell Sarah everything, every detail, every date, every name. I put my hands flat on the table, not to make things easier for me, because it's the only thing left that's yours to give. Logan nodded. Not the nod of someone agreeing with a suggestion, the nod of someone who has been waiting for someone to tell them exactly what to do with the wreckage. I stood up. Logan's voice stopped me at the door, rough and very quiet. Dad, I turned. I'm sorry. He said it the way people say things they know are insufficient and say them anyway because silence would be worse. I know it doesn't reach what I did, but I need you to know that I know what I did. All of it. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I know you do, son, I said. Then I put my hand on his shoulder 1 second, the weight of a hand, nothing more, and walked out into the hallway where Sarah was waiting, with 2 cups of coffee, both of them hot this time, and the careful expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to know when not to ask. I took the coffee. She fell into step beside me. Neither of us spoke until we reached the elevator, and by then, neither of us needed to. The conference room on the 4th floor had a whiteboard covered in diagrams that Eddie Reyes had drawn sometime in the past 3 hours, the kind of visual map that made complete sense to the person who'd drawn it and required a guided tour for everyone else. He walked us through it with the focused efficiency of someone who communicated best when the subject was information rather than people pointing to boxes and arrows and strings of numbers with the unself-conscious confidence of a man in his element. Sarah had her legal pad. I had my coffee, which I was treating with considerably more respect than the cold cup I'd abandoned at 2 in the morning. Logan's laptop. Eddie began pulling up a split screen on the conference room display. We found the software he used to generate the fraudulent signature files. It's commercially available, the kind of program that forges digital signatures well enough to pass casual inspection, but falls apart under forensic analysis. The signatures on the financial documents match the output profile of this specific version. He pointed to a highlighted line of code. We can prove those signatures were machine-generated and not authentic within a margin of error that no defense attorney is going to want to argue in front of a federal jury. I looked at the screen. How long does that take to explain to a jury? About 45 minutes, Eddie said. I've done it before. They follow it. The second document package came from Arthur Mills, a sworn affidavit 23 pages, notarized by a public notary in Chula Vista, and transmitted to FBI Wilshire by secure federal courier at 4:30 in the morning. Eddie pulled up the key section, a detailed technical explanation of Pacific Rim Commercial Bank's internal administrative access system, including the specific protocol required to open accounts through the back-end management portal. Mills identifies 6 individuals with that level of access during the relevant period, Eddie said. 3 of them are among the bank officers already arrested tonight, and the IP login records, he pulled up another screen, show repeated access from an external address that traces to the Century City offices of Morrison Strategic Consulting, Logan's company. Sarah underlined something on her legal pad 3 times. That connects the account creation directly to Logan, and through Logan to the Blackwood network. It does. Eddie clicked to the next document, and this is what closes it. Dr. Patricia Webb's sworn affidavit was 4 pages. Precise, clinical, formatted with the exactness of someone who spent her professional life writing documentation that would be scrutinized by insurance companies and medical review boards. She had video confirmed her identity to Sarah at 6:30 the previous evening. Before the physical document was transmitted, the affidavit itself was the operative legal instrument. The video simply a precaution against any challenge to her identity. The relevant paragraph was highlighted in yellow. Jack Morrison was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center at 6:52 in the morning. General anesthesia was administered at 7:41. The surgical procedure concluded at 1:17 in the afternoon. The patient remained in post-anesthesia recovery until 5:49 in the evening, at which point he was transferred to a standard room. He was incapable of independent action or coherent decision-making for the entirety of this period. The Morrison Strategic Consulting account at Pacific Rim had been opened at 10:22 in the morning. He was unconscious, I said. Not for the room, for myself. Hearing it stated in clinical language in a signed legal document, after everything that had happened to arrive at this room, it landed differently than I'd expected. Not with relief exactly. With something more like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting to prove something he has always known, and has finally on a morning, when he's running on no sleep and bad coffee, been handed the proof in writing. Sarah put her hand briefly on my forearm. Not a gesture of comfort exactly. Sarah was not a demonstrative person, more like acknowledgement. She'd seen the document. She understood what it meant. She was marking the moment. "That's everything we need to vacate the charges," she said. "All of them." Eddie nodded. "I'll have the full technical report filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office by 8 this morning. Motion to dismiss supporting affidavits, forensic analysis, the complete package." I thought about Helen 2 floors down in the medical room, sleeping finally after the paramedics had cleared her, and a doctor had checked her over, and a federal agent had taken her statement, with the careful professionalism of someone who understood that the woman in front of them had spent 3 days being stronger than most people manage in a lifetime. I thought about the red bag in federal evidence custody, now its contents finally doing the work they'd been waiting 5 years to do. I thought about Ray Kowalski's cabin on the Topanga Canyon Road, the kerosene lamp still burning on this table when I'd left. "Eddie," I said, "good work." He looked mildly surprised the way people do when they're not expecting to be thanked directly. "I just follow the data," he said. The data was cooperative this time. Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, but the focused attention of someone receiving significant news. "Coleman." She listened for 12 seconds. Her eyes moved to mine. "Confirmed. Thank you, Captain." She ended the call and set the phone on the table. "Raymond Blackwood," she said, "was just taken into custody at Terminal 4 JFK. He was carrying 2 passports and $140,000 in cash." She paused. "He is being transported to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, pending arraignment." I sat with that for a moment. Raymond Blackwood, the voice on the first cassette tape, the man whose name had been in every file I'd built for 2 years, whose organization had burned my evidence and buried my witnesses and reached into my family and turned my son into a weapon against me, was in federal custody in a detention center in Brooklyn, and the sun was coming up over Los Angeles, and I was sitting in a conference room with cold coffee and a complete evidentiary package that was going to dismantle 5 years of his work, brick by brick. "Okay," I said. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I thought I'd feel more," I said honestly. "But mostly I just feel tired." Sarah picked up her coffee. "That's how it usually feels. The movie's got that part wrong." Outside the conference room window, Los Angeles was beginning to turn gold. The television in the 3rd floor break room was tuned to a local news channel, and by 7:15 in the morning, it had stopped covering anything else. I stood in the doorway with my coffee and watched the city I'd spent 38 years working take itself apart in real time. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking Blackwood, Capital Group, executives arrested in multi-state federal operation. Beneath it, a crawl of names and institutions that kept updating as the morning moved forward, each edition representing another thread in a net that had taken 5 years and one red leather bag to finish weaving. 7 officers from Pacific Rim Commercial Bank, taken into custody at their homes in Bel Air and Pasadena before dawn. 3 LAPD officers placed on administrative leave pending internal affairs. Review one of them, a lieutenant I recognized from my last 2 years on the force. A man I'd eaten lunch with a dozen times. A man who had apparently been eating lunch with one hand and holding a door open for Raymond Blackwood with the other. 2 attorneys from Blackwood Capital's Century City legal team, arrested in their offices at 7:02 in the morning, still in the suits they'd been wearing the previous evening. And Vanessa already processed in federal holding, already generating the kind of legal activity that happens when the right families lose their freedom and discover that all the money they had accumulated specifically to avoid this outcome has a ceiling. A reporter outside the federal courthouse in downtown LA was describing the scope of the operation with the practiced urgency of someone who had rehearsed for a story this big without believing it would actually come. I turned the sound down and watched the images police vehicle's camera cruise a federal marshal I didn't recognize reading from a prepared statement, and felt something that I could only describe as the particular quiet that comes after a very loud thing finally stops. I found Helen on the 3rd floor in the small medical room at the end of the east corridor. She was awake. She was sitting up in the narrow bed with a hospital blanket pulled across her lap and a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her. And when I appeared in the doorway, she looked at me with an expression that contained everything we hadn't been able to say. Yet the 3 days of separation, the 5 years of secrets, the 41 years of everything else, and compressed it into something that fit in a single look between 2 people who had been married long enough to speak that way. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. She took my hand in both of hers, the way she used to hold my hand in the early years, not loosely, not casually, but with a specific intentional grip that said, I am holding this, and I intend to keep holding it. Raymond Blackwood is in federal custody in New York, I said. I know, she said. Sarah came by an hour ago. Vanessa. I know that too. She looked down at our hands. Logan. He told them everything, I said. It won't fix what he did, but he told them everything. Helen was quiet for a moment, not the forbidden kind of quiet, but the quiet of someone integrating information that required a moment to settle. Her thumb moved across the back of my hand, the small automatic gesture she'd been making for 4 decades, without either of us ever commenting on it. The bag, she said finally. Jack, I should have told you about the bag 5 years ago. You were afraid, I said. I was afraid, she agreed. And I was wrong. I kept thinking I was protecting you, and I was actually just carrying it alone. Her voice tightened. I watched you retire with that unfinished case sitting in your chest like a stone, and I had the evidence in our bedroom closet, and I told myself every single day that I'd tell you when the time was right. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet and furious in the way that people get when they're angry at themselves. The time was never going to be right. I just didn't want to say it. Helen, I put my free hand over hers. We both made decisions out of love that didn't serve the people we were trying to protect. I think we can afford to forgive each other for that. She laughed a short, wet sound that was mostly not crying and leaned her forehead against my shoulder. I want to go home, she said. I want to sit in my kitchen and drink coffee that isn't from a machine and not think about any of this for approximately a week. Sarah says we can leave by noon, I said. Good. She didn't lift her head from my shoulder. Jack, the garden. You left the irrigation valve open when you ran inside yesterday. I thought about the irrigation valve I'd dropped in the dirt 3 days ago, the tool I'd left on the ground when everything changed. It felt like it had happened in a different life. In some ways, it had. I'll fix it when we get home, I said. You always say that, Helen said, and I always fix it eventually. She tightened her grip on my hand, and I sat there on the edge of the narrow bed in the FBI medical room, while Los Angeles woke up outside and the television down the hall kept adding names to a crawl that would run all day, and I thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 3 days. It was, in its own way, the best thing I had felt in a long time. Christine Valdez had a corner office on the 12th floor of the federal building on Spring Street, and the view from it took in a significant portion of downtown Los Angeles in a way that I suspected was deliberately chosen. People who prosecuted federal cases in this city needed to be reminded occasionally of the scale of what they were working inside. She was 51 years old with the composed authority of someone who had spent 2 decades making very difficult decisions in front of very difficult people and had stopped finding either the decisions or the people particularly intimidating. She stood when I came in, shook my hand once, and sat back down without ceremony. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "everything you say today becomes part of the formal federal record. You understand that?" "I do," I said. I had spent 38 years on the other side of this kind of table. Sitting on this side felt less strange than I'd expected, which probably said something about the nature of truth, that it doesn't particularly care which chair you're in when you tell it. Sarah sat to my left. Christine's assistant sat to her right with a digital recorder and a legal pad. The room smelled like old carpet and new coffee, and the specific institutional gravity of a place where things got decided. I talked for 47 minutes. I told it the way I used to write reports, chronologically, specifically, without editorializing. The phone call from Helen, the red bag, Ray Kowalski's cabin, the cassette tapes, Arthur Mills in Chula Vista, Marcus Tate's camera footage, the warehouse on Water Street. I described every conversation, every decision, every moment where I'd chosen to act rather than wait, and I explained my reasoning for each one in the flat professional language of someone who has testified enough times to know that juries and attorneys respond better to clarity than to emotion. Christine listened without interrupting. She was the kind of attorney who took notes by hand rather than on a screen, and I could see her pen moving steadily across the legal pad, throughout small, precise marks that captured what she needed and nothing else. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "do you believe your son acted under coercion or of his own free will?" I had known the question was coming. I had been turning it over in my mind since the conversation with Logan in the interview room, since the warehouse, since the cabin in Topanga, when I had listened to the third tape and understood for the first time what had been done to my son before he ever made the choices that had brought us here. "Olent," I said, "he was targeted deliberately and manipulated systematically over a period of years. That's true." I looked at Christine across the table. "He also made choices. He took my wallet off a gurney while I was unconscious. He put evidence in my house. He stood in a warehouse and didn't stop what was happening to his mother when he had the opportunity to try." I stopped. "The coercion explains some of it. It doesn't explain all of it. And I think Logan would tell you the same thing." Christine wrote something on her pad. "Is there anything you want to add?" she said. "That isn't in the investigative record." I thought about Helen's notebook. The 5 years of careful observation she'd conducted alone in the house we'd lived in for 30 years, recording license plates and midnight phone calls and the questions Logan asked at Sunday dinner, protecting a bag she was too afraid to open and too afraid to throw away. My wife kept a detailed record of surveillance activity against our household, spanning 5 years, I said. That notebook is currently in federal evidence custody along with the contents of the bag. I'd ask that its value be acknowledged in the formal record. She did what she thought she had to do under circumstances that were genuinely frightening, and she did it carefully enough that it contributed to this investigation. I paused. She deserves to have that noted somewhere official. Christine looked up from her pad. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but recognition. "I'll see to it personally," she said. When we were done, Sarah walked me to the elevator. The building lobby was moving at the pace of a Tuesday morning, people passing through security with coffee cups and laptop bags, the ordinary machinery of institutional life continuing without reference to anything that had happened in the past 4 days. 6 weeks, Sarah said, pressing the lobby button. "That's when the motion hearing is scheduled. Judge Patricia Holt." "Is she good?" "She's fair," Sarah said, which in her vocabulary was considerably higher praise. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in and turned around. "Sarah." She looked at me. "Thank you for believing me before you had a reason to." She gave me the look she reserved for statements she found obvious. "You've never lied to me in 30 years, Jack. That was the reason." The doors closed. In the lobby, I found a bench near the window and sat down and called Helen, and she answered on the second ring, and just the sound of her voice unhurried at home in our kitchen was enough to make my chest unknot in a way that nothing else had managed for 4 days. "The irrigation valve," she said before I could speak. "I'll fix it tonight," I said. "You said that yesterday." "Tonight I mean it." She laughed her real laugh, the one she reserved for things that were actually funny, rather than just politely amusing. and I sat on a bench in the federal building lobby and held the phone against my ear and let it fill the space that the past 4 days had hollowed out. When I hung up, Helen had told me the motion hearing date, and that she'd bought groceries and that she wanted pasta for dinner because she'd been thinking about it since the warehouse and she'd earned it. She had absolutely earned it. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen a minute later. Logan's attorney called this morning. He's asking if we'd be willing to speak with Logan before sentencing. I told them I'd ask you. A pause. Then a second message. What do you want to do? I sat with that for a long time. 6 weeks later, Helen chose my tie. She stood in front of the closet in our Silver Lake bedroom on a Tuesday morning in late January, holding two options at arm's length, with the focused deliberation she brought to decisions that mattered, and selected the Navy one without explanation. I put it on without asking for one. 41 years had taught both of us which conversations needed to happen and which ones were already finished. The drive to the federal courthouse on Spring Street took 22 minutes. We didn't talk much. Helen kept her hand on my knee the way she did on long drives, the automatic gesture of a woman who had decided 40 years ago that physical proximity was its own form of communication and had never found a reason to revise that conclusion. The courtroom on the 4th floor was smaller than people expect federal courtrooms to be. Pale wood paneling, rows of fixed seating, a seal on the wall that I had looked at from the other side more times than I could count. I sat down beside Helen in the gallery and found for the first time in 6 weeks that I had nothing left to prepare. The work was done. The evidence was filed. Sarah had done what Sarah always did, which was to build something so thorough that the only question was the speed of the conclusion. Logan came in through the side door with his attorney Gresham at 7 minutes past 9. He was wearing a gray suit I didn't recognize. Someone had bought it for him, or he'd bought it for this, and he sat in the defendant's section without looking at the gallery. His jaw was set. His hands were in his lap. He looked like a man who had decided that whatever happened in this room, he was going to face it without flinching, and who wasn't entirely sure he was going to manage it. Judge Patricia Holt entered at 9:15, and the room stood. She was 60 silver-haired with the unhurried precision of someone who had presided over enough proceedings to understand that efficiency and thoroughness were not opposites. She reviewed the motion documents for 3 minutes without speaking her pen, moving occasionally across her copy, and then she looked up. The federal prosecutor presented the motion to dismiss. Sarah stood and delivered her supporting argument in 11 minutes. The fraudulent signatures, the surgical alibi established by Dr. Webb, the IP logs, Arthur Mills, Marcus Tate's footage, the complete evidentiary package that Eddie Reyes had filed 6 weeks ago. Judge Holt listened with the same quality of attention I'd seen Christine Valdez use, total specific, giving nothing away about where it was landing until she chose to give something away. When Sarah sat down, the courtroom was very quiet. Judge Holt looked at the motion documents one more time. Then she looked up at the room. The court has reviewed the evidence submitted in support of this motion, she said, and finds it conclusive on every count. The charges against Jack Morrison are hereby dismissed with prejudice. She paused. The court further notes for the formal record the contribution of Helen Morrison to the investigative process that made this outcome possible. Her documentation of surveillance activity over a period of 5 years was material to this case. Helen's hand found mine under the shared armrest between our seats and gripped it so tightly that I felt the pressure in my knuckles. She was not crying. She was doing the thing she did when something mattered enough that crying would have felt insufficient, holding absolutely still and letting it move through her. I put my other hand over hers. Then, because I couldn't not do it, I looked across the room. Logan was already looking at me. I don't know how long he'd been looking. Long enough that when our eyes met, there was no surprise in it on either side, just the particular quality of attention that happens between two people who have been aware of each other across a room and have finally stopped pretending otherwise. His face was composed in a way that had cost him something to achieve. His eyes were red at the rims. He was sitting very straight. He looked in that moment like someone who had made peace with the fact that he was going to carry what he'd done for the rest of his life, and had decided that carrying it upright was the only version of it he could live with. He dipped his chin. Once, small enough that almost no one in the room would have noticed it. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I dipped mine back. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was not the beginning of something repaired. It was two people, a father and a son, which is one of the oldest and most complicated arrangements in human experience, looking at each other across a federal courtroom and acknowledging without words that they had both been in that room and that both of them were going to have to live with what that meant. That was all it was. It was enough. Sarah appeared at my elbow as Helen and I stood to leave. She had her coat over her arm and the expression she used when she was done with a case and ready to go. Eat something that wasn't courtroom vending machine food. "There are reporters outside," she said. "I know," I said. "You don't have to say anything." "I know that too." Helen tucked her hand into the crook of my arm as we walked toward the door, and I felt the familiar weight of her beside me, the specific gravity of a person you have spent 41 years learning to walk next to and thought about nothing in particular, except that the door at the end of the corridor led outside, and outside was Los Angeles in January, cold and gold and indifferent and mine. I pushed the door open. The reporters were waiting on the courthouse steps, which I had expected, and there were more of them than I'd anticipated, which I had not. I stopped at the top of the steps. Helen stood beside me. Sarah was 2 steps back, giving us the space that the moment required and that she understood without being asked. A reporter near the front, young dark coat recorder extended, called out before I'd fully stopped moving. "Mr. Morrison, do you have a statement?" "A short one," I said. The crowd settled. "I spent 38 years trying to do this job honestly," I said. "What happened to me over the past several weeks was an attempt to use that career against me. It didn't work because the truth is harder to bury than the people who tried to bury it understood." I paused. "That's all I have." Another reporter. "Mr. Morrison, can you forgive your son?" I had known that question was coming since the morning Logan's attorney had called Helen. I had been turning the answer over in my mind for 6 weeks, holding it up to different lights, checking it for the places where sentiment shaded into dishonesty. "I still love the boy I raised," I said. "But the man who let them take his mother and who planned to let them take his father, he has to answer for his choices. Love and accountability are not opposites. They never have been." I took Helen's arm and we walked down the steps. Sarah caught up to us at the bottom. She didn't say anything. She walked with us to the car and shook my hand. Once firm, brief, the handshake of someone who considered the matter closed, and then she walked back toward the building because Sarah Coleman always had another case. We drove home. Silver Lake in January was bare-treed and quiet, the kind of neighborhood that contracted slightly in winter and would expand again in spring when the jacarandas came back. Helen's garden looked exactly as I had left it. The afternoon everything changed, the rosemary along the south fence, the Meyer lemon in the corner, the flagstone path she'd laid herself 30 years ago. The irrigation valve I'd dropped in the dirt was still there, exactly where it had fallen. I picked it up. Inside, I set the red bag on the kitchen table. It had been in federal evidence custody for 6 weeks, and Sarah had arranged for its return that morning, and now it sat on the same surface where Helen and I ate breakfast every day, looking exactly like what it was, a worn leather bag that had cost us nearly everything and given us back more than we'd lost. Helen stood across the table from me and looked at it. "Next time you keep a secret for 5 years," I said, "tell me sooner." Helen's eyes filled. She laughed at the same time, the way she did when something was too true to just cry about. "Next time you investigate a crime family," she said, "don't let our son marry into it." I laughed. It started somewhere in my chest, where the tension had been living for 6 weeks, and came out of me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like a sound I'd forgotten I could make. Helen was laughing too, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes bright and wet. And for a moment, we were just 2 people standing in a kitchen in Silver Lake, laughing at something that wasn't funny, and was also the funniest thing either of us had said in months. We sat down at the table. Neither of us moved to put the bag away. It sat between us and the afternoon light, coming through the kitchen window, the same light that came through that window every January afternoon, the same light that would come through next January and the one after that. The red bag had taken nearly everything from us. Anne brought it all back. I reached across the table and took Helen's hand. Outside, the irrigation valve was still waiting. It could wait a little longer. Looking back at everything that happened, I made mistakes I can never fully undo. I kept secrets when I should have shared truth. I protected people in ways that left them vulnerable to exactly the things I was trying to protect them from. Don't be like me. If you're carrying something alone right now, a secret, a fear, a burden, you think love requires you to hold in silence, put it down. Share it with someone who deserves to know. Family betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows in the silence between the people sitting at your own dinner table. I've learned that family story doesn't mean a story without pain. It means a story worth telling honestly. God gave me a second chance to tell mine with truth instead of silence, and I don't take that lightly. My personal opinion. The people who love you can handle more truth than you think. And the people who can't, well, that's information worth having. This has been our family story. And if any part of it felt familiar, if you've ever faced family betrayal, ever fought to protect something that mattered, ever had to choose between love and accountability, drop a comment below and tell me about it. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time, because the stories we share next will stay with you. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than I can say. One final note. Some of the stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, we're glad you're here.